Good morning, members of the board. This really is a time of unprecedented economic news. I haven't seen anything like this, nor has anybody in really the history of economic analysis. What we're running up against is data that is really unrecognizable. They're data that we really don't even know how to process. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But what it really means is that there is no way right now that we can do a single point forecast and give an exact number in terms of what our prediction might be in terms of the amount of revenue that we would lose due to the COVID-19 crisis. This is the first time in the history of the world that we actually voluntarily shut down the economy. This is a man-made disruption, and it will lead to an economic recession. The thing is that much of the economy is not broken. Most recessions, something is wrong. Either there's a financial crisis or some kind of a shock to the economy that throws us into a recession, and it usually starts with a sector. In this particular case, we shut down on our own. And so the recovery from this is going to be very unique, and that's something that we're taking a look at. There are three critical factors that we're monitoring on a very regular basis and we're looking at. And the first one is really the length of the disruption. You know, the good news is that the curve is flattening. We've heard that the peak has been brought forward, and we hear from the federal government that we might be able to reopen by May 1st. There are also reports that that might be on a county-by-county basis, but there really is no defined plan on how we reopen. That was yesterday. And then also yesterday, Federal Reserve Chair Powell said that the economy was deteriorating quickly, and that he didn't believe that we were going to open until after July. So the length of the disruption is really unknown. What we do know is that about half of our economy is based on the services industry. And the services industry requires people to interact with each other. By its very nature, it requires human interaction. And the severity of this particular disruption is going to be determined a lot on when we can actually get back to work and start working with each other. And that really means what happens with the social distancing and how we how that plays out over the course of the next weeks, months, and years. When we do come back, the question is what industries will be hurt the most and which ones won't. So we're looking at all of these things. In order to do that, what we've done is we've developed scenarios. We've developed a set of 50 scenarios in a dynamic model that we can take a look at that give us a multiple set of possible outcomes based upon the length, the depth, and the severity of the potential disruption. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those throughout this presentation. I was asked to add a few slides just about the general economy and to show how unprecedented these numbers really are. This graph shows the initial jobs claims throughout from 1967 all the way up until just a few weeks ago. At the depth of the Great Recession, we had 661,000 was the record number that happened on May 21st, 2009 in terms of initial jobless claims being filed. Last week, we saw 10 times the number of people file for unemployment. That's 6,600,000 people. In the last 3 weeks, 16,789,000 Americans have filed for unemployment. These type of numbers are not only unprecedented, there's no way to really understand what the long-term ramification of this is. And this is not a normal recession. Not everybody is being affected in the same way. Different sectors are being affected in disproportionate amounts of ways. When we take a look at the San Diego economy, I wanted to share some information with you on which sectors were going to be hit the hardest. If you look at who's being hit, we see industries like tourism. Tourism will be decimated for a long time, possibly measured in years and not just months. The retail industry, the restaurant industry, the real estate industry, anything to do with entertainment, personal services, haircuts, and nail salons, those type of things that require human interaction are all extremely impacted right now. That represents about 34% of the employment in San Diego. The sectors that are going to be hit less are healthcare, education, military, the government, software and biotech, utilities and transportation, and professional services like accountants and financial advisors, engineers. Those type of work can be done remotely. And that represents about 66% of our economy. So a full 1/3 of our economy is hit extremely hard by this particular disruption. This slide is a slide that came from Goldman Sachs, and it takes a look at the change in gross domestic product over the last 20 or so years. And you see the Great Recession here. At the very worst, for quarterly loss, we lost 9% in terms of a reduction in gross domestic product, and that happened back in 2008. These are the projections that Goldman Sachs put out just recently. They were looking at now a 24% decrease in the next couple of quarters, and then a very high increase after that. These are unprecedented volatilities. As you can see, there's nothing like this in history that looks like this. So it's going to be very interesting to follow this as we go forward. The good news is that this isn't going to last forever. At some point, we will recover, and it's just going to be a question about what that looks like. This morning, JP Morgan came out with a revised forecast. Their number went from 25% down to 40%. So we are still in a state where we really don't know what the impact is. We've shown you this slide many times before. This is the TransNet revenue forecast. This is the forecast that includes the 3.7 million people population adjustment from the Department of Finance. And the good news on this slide is that we still have 28 years of collection left in the TransNet revenue forecast. And so we will be hit negatively in 2000, possibly 2001, depending upon the length of the recession. We may take a little bit of a longer hit, but we still have $15.3 billion in sales tax revenue to collect. And so we will be revising this forecast once we come out of this pandemic and understand what the ramifications are to the economy. For the purposes of modeling, one of the things that we did was to take a look at the past recessions and just kind of use them as models for our forecasts. If you go back to the 1991 recession, you saw this blue line shows you the reduction in, or the collection of TransNet revenue. And what you see is that there was a dip in 1991, and it took us about 4 years to recover to the levels that we were at previously. And this is really a moderate recession. The 2001 recession was a mild recession. We never lost any ground in terms of sales tax collection, although the rate of increase did slow, as you can see. And then when we go to the Great Recession, which was a severe recession, it took us about 6.5 years to get back to the exact point that we were at before the recession, and it took us another 4 years before we hit the trend line. So almost 10 years to recover from the Great Recession in terms of sales tax collection. The reason I bring this up is that economists right now are very much debating what the shape of this recovery is going to be. And the shape of the recovery and the depth of the recovery are two of those key factors that are going to make the difference between whether and how much we lose or gain in sales tax revenue. We've done collected information from our vendors, but we've also done primary research. We have staff calling the top 100 contributors to sales tax and asking them how this pandemic is impacting their businesses. And so we're coming up with our best estimates in terms of how sales tax is being impacted on a sector-by-sector basis. We're monitoring 28 different sectors. 17 of them are presented here on this particular slide. And what you can see is that the retail sector, apparel sales, department stores, furniture, for instance, have been hit extremely hard, losing more than half of their sales. Recreational products, et cetera, are hit very hard. Automobile sales, so anything in the transportation industry, is also hit hard. Most dealerships are closed down for new auto sales currently. There are some areas that are growing. They include drugstores, miscellaneous retail, which includes the online or Amazon type sales, food market sales, and liquor store sales are up to kind of balance this out. But these are some of the inputs that we have in our model. This graph shows the impact on taxable retail sales. The dark blue bars show the actual taxable retail sales here in the San Diego region, and the light blue bars show what a forecast would be if the economy just continued to grow at the clip that it had been growing since the Great Recession. So that's what this graph shows. But people need to have jobs and they need to get out there and spend money. And so what I'd like to show you are a couple of scenarios on what the impact could be on taxable retail sales, depending upon the type of recession we actually go into. This first scenario shows what the impact would be if we had a 2-month disruption. And so the 2-month disruption really talks about the economy being disrupted from from March 15th through May 15th. So right now there are indications that we may open up at the end of April. That gives us another 2-week buffer on top of that. If we had just that as the disruption, and we had a V-shaped recovery, as you've heard economists talk about, we would lose about $10 billion in taxable retail sales over the next couple of years, and then we would move back to the trend line. This next line shows what would happen if it took us 3 months to get back and it took us longer to recover. And you see that the impact on taxable sales would be about another 50% loss. So we'd be up to about $15.9 billion, so almost a 60% additional loss. This shows a third scenario where we would have a 3-month disruption, but instead of having a V recovery, as economists talk about, we would have something that would be closer to a U-shaped recovery. A U-shaped recovery would happen if we kind of stayed at the bottom for a while, and this is a possibility with all of the social distancing rules and regulations that we don't even know how they will impact the economy. If something like this happens, we could be looking at a loss of about $34 billion in sales tax revenue, and you see that it would also impact our taxable retail sales, and this would impact us for several years into the future. And finally, I'm showing a scenario here in red that shows what it would look like if we shut down the economy for 5 months and that we went into a recession, and it took us essentially 10 years to recover, something similar to the Great Recession. And you see in a case like this, we could lose as much as $110 billion in retail sales. Moving back to the TransNet revenue. So this is specific to our sales tax forecast. This is our pre-COVID forecast. So there's a blown up line from the slide that I showed you previously. You can see that we pretty much expected us to have a straight line increases from 2020 on. And then this is what happens with some of the disruptions. If we take a look at a COVID-only disruption, so that would be a 2-month disruption with a V-shaped recovery, we would lose about $28 million in sales tax revenue. This scenario would also assume that we really didn't go into a recession. If we went into a moderate recession, we would lose about $52 million in sales tax revenue, and we would come out of it sometime in 2022, fiscal 2022. A severe recession, where we were disrupted for about 3 months and we had a U-shaped recovery, would result in a loss of about $203 million in sales tax revenue. And just for comparative purposes, I will show you what it looks like if we went into something that mimicked the Great Recession. In that case, we would lose about $569 million in sales tax revenue, so close to $500 million. In addition to that, we've heard people say that this may turn into something like the Great Depression. And although I don't believe that this scenario is realistic at this time, this forecast shows you what it would look like if we fell into something like the Great Depression. And you can see that we're probably very far from something like this. But in a case like that, we would lose somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.2 billion in sales tax revenue. So we build our models kind of from the bottom up. We talk to the different different industries. We try to understand what's happening at the actual business level, and then we validate these using independent forecasts. And this is similar to the process that we use when we do our TransNet revenue forecast. What we did is we went out and we took a look at every major economic firm that was doing a national forecast, and we took their forecasts, which are usually forecasts of GDP, and applied them to our sales tax revenue to take a look at how our model compares to theirs. So again, here is our pre-COVID forecast. When we take a look at the Oxford Economics forecast, and these forecasts were all released in the late May time frame, they would result in a 2% decrease. There's word that Oxford will be lowering their forecast. IHS shows a -5%. UCLA forecast also shows a -5%. Moody's shows 7% down. The Wells Fargo forecast shows 9% down. Goldman Sachs shows 10% down. Deloitte shows 13% down. And then since then, Goldman Sachs has revised, and they're down by 12%. The yellow dotted line shows you our forecast. Our forecast right now, the moderate forecast with a 2-month disruption with a V-shaped recovery, fits right in the middle of these national forecasts. So I'm relatively comfortable that the information that we're using fits well with national forecasts, although nobody really knows what the end result is of this. We will be updating this on a regular basis as information comes in to understand what the long-term ramifications are. This last line shows what would happen if instead of having a V-shaped recovery, we had a longer-term recovery, and that would entail a $65 billion loss in revenue. When we talk about TransNet revenue, we are on a fiscal year rather than a calendar year, and so it's very difficult sometimes when you hear news reports to try to correlate that to what's happening with TransNet. If you take a look at fiscal 2020, we've done pretty well in terms of our sales tax collection for the first 3 quarters of fiscal 2020. There's something else you have to take into account, and that is that our sales tax revenue collections lag by 2 months. And so on April 21st, we will be receiving our payments, but those payments will be reflective of February collections. So as you can see here by the first orange bar, we anticipate those collections to be good, even though we are in the middle of this crisis. The revenue, or the decrease in revenue that we see, the 50%, will occur, and it'll be associated with the month of April, and those payments will be made sometime in June. I guess whether it's a good news or bad news, the fact that this crisis happens over 2 fiscal years helps us buffer the 2 different years. So half of the crisis is going to be recorded in fiscal 2020. The other half is fiscal 2021. Most of the national forecasts, when you hear people talk, they're talking calendar year. So they're talking about what's happening in the calendar year 2020. So not completely comparable, but what I wanted to show you here is that it results in about a 7% decrease in 2020, and then about a 9.2% decrease if we're looking at a 2-month scenario in fiscal year 2021. This table shows you 40 of the scenarios that we put together with a probability and a likelihood of these scenarios happening. I've been asked to come up with a single number, and I think that that is really a fool's errand to try to do. And so instead what we've done is we've come up with probabilities that any one forecast would occur given the inputs that we've been discussing. So the way to read this particular table is that on the left-hand column, there are the different scenarios, starting with the COVID-only scenario, meaning we don't go into a recession. We would go into a mild recession with a V-shaped recovery, moderate recession with a V-shaped recovery, et cetera. So it's the type of recession on the left-hand side, and then the length of disruption. And that means when we get back to normal or back to work. The disruption right now is from March 15th through May 15th. That would be a 2-month disruption. And you see 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. This particular graph is color-coded, or this table is color-coded. And it gives you what we believe is the highest probability of these different scenarios happening. So right now, the highest probability would be that we would be back at work sometime starting in May 15th. We would go into a moderate recession, recovering back to baseline by fiscal 22. That would result in a TransNet sales tax reduction of about $51.9 million. I think equally as likely is that we won't be back to work until sometime in June. And so that would probably push us into a deeper recession with a longer recovery. So we're putting our bets on the moderate V-long 3-month recession, which would be a negative or a loss of $81.6 million. And even with those two, you see that the probability is not very high that would happen, maybe 15% for either one of those scenarios. So given what we know today, if we had to estimate what we were going to lose in TransNet sales tax revenue, my prediction is that we would lose with a 40% probability somewhere between $50 and $100 million, and with a 75% probability somewhere between $50 and $200 million. And again, we don't have enough information to really come up with a solid number yet, and we'll be updating this information on a regular basis as we have new data. This is the last slide that I want to show you. This slide compares fiscal year to calendar year. There's been questions I've had in terms of people asking if I can translate that. So this slide shows that. It shows some of the most likely scenarios also. The way to read this particular slide, and I've color-coded some of the data in blue just to make it easier to go through this slide. If you take a look at our prediction or our baseline forecast for TransNet revenue for fiscal year 2020, our forecast was $319.1 million. If we believe that scenario with a 2-month disruption with a V-shaped recovery is going to happen, that new forecast would show $297.5 million, or a reduction of $21 million in fiscal year 2020. The forecast would then show $298.4 million in 2021, rather than the $328 we had forecast, for a loss of another $30 million. And then we would be back to baseline by fiscal 2020 for a total loss at the very bottom column of $51 million. And so this shows you the different scenarios, and it also shows how wildly different some of them can be based upon what the assumptions are that one would make. We provide this information so that as you have, as you think about what might happen, you can take a look at this table and you can determine on your own what potential impacts there might be. So that concludes my presentation on the TransNet revenue and the brief update on the San Diego economy.